my sweet Strangelings. Welcome to Mystic Mondays, and today we have a very special guest. Without further ado, let's get on with today's episode. So, hello, Natalie. I see that you have had a very impressive background. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yes, my name is Natalie Garcia, aka La Brujita del Jardín. I'm a writer, author, poet. I kind of started branching out into entrepreneur, entertainer. I talk about a lot of more art, indigenous practices, but also metaphysical practices. I'm an energy reader. Um, I dabble into a lot of things. So, but definitely an artist at heart, and I kind of bring whatever my visions are in my head into life through art and creativity, poetry, and now theater. I guess So it's a lot of art.
I love that. Well, and on the last podcast, I had my friend Sapphire, and we talked about that. She comes also from a very artistic background, and she was an animator. Now she does her podcast, and she's an occultist practitioner. And I guess like one thing that I'm finding is that a lot of people who are very artistic learn to channel source, like learn to channel what's more than beyond this plane. And so I guess like with your background of being an author and being a practitioner and also being an artist and a performer, do you ever feel like when you are doing these things that you get visions, you feel like you're getting downloads from like above, whatever you want to call it, right?
Absolutely. I feel like I tap into like different realities. That is like one thing I realized. Like I feel like a time traveler because I'll tap into different eras. Like if I'm doing something really like listening to like Billy Holiday or Ella Fitzgerald, and to like towards a project like I'm writing music or something like that. I like tap into that, and I feel like I tap into a past life, or I tap into that energy of that artist. Like, I have such a big connection to, which is funny, with like Mac Miller, because I'll tap into some poetry with him, and it's like I'll start writing, I'll start flowing.
Wow.
Um, yeah, I tap into even with dance. Like I was a dancer, so even before I was like expressing myself like through words or through art, I didn't know I was an artist. I was a little girl, and I would just
Yeah.
dance, and I feel like I just lived in this different world in my head. Like when I would dance, I like saw the mirror. Like I don't know. It was just like I would dance in front of the mirror and just completely like leave the world that I was in
I
and tap
love
into a
that.
different world.
I love that so much. Well, we'll get more into that, but before we get into that, you touched base on a couple of things that I think is so important because and that, one of the reasons why I'm so happy to have you on here because I feel like as a Latina and Latinas and just Latina culture, we are very spiritual people, even though like some would unfortunately try to kind of demystify that and make it more religious and, conservative in a way that I don't think is really what our culture was made up from originally. So can you talk a little bit more about what got you into like your spirituality, into your practice, into your faith?
Yeah, I didn't grow up in your like typical Catholic driven family. I mean, I did, but I didn't. See, my parents were like rebels. They came from a very strict Catholic religious background. My grandmothers and my grandfathers, they were very religious. Like you get married, you have kids, and this is what it is, and you pray, you go to church every Sunday, right? Well, my parents left Mexico and migrated here. I'm first generation, and they came here in the 70s, like late 60s, 70s. So right when like, Chicano movement, the rebel movement, like it was hippies. So they assimilated to that. They really like loved rock. They loved, art, all of that. So I grew up in a very hippie household. My mom's very connected to plants and plant medicine. She explored a lot of herbalism. She is really, really connected to she used to sell herbs at the swap meet. And then my dad is really into more scientific things like astrology, planetary, solar flares, and all of that. So we have this this family thing where we were constantly talking about metaphysics, like ghosts. We'll talk about things like things that you normally don't talk in families that are super religious. We believe we believe in fairies, we believe in duendes. We talk about like all of these things, like oh, ese espíritu se me apareció, you know, which a spirit like appeared to me basically, you know, and or this, my mom would see something in her dreams and she'll talk about it. We're very open about things like that. It wasn't like, oh, that's demonic, don't talk about it, you know. So that gave me permission to really start exploring different outlets like IFA, you know, even like Santeria, like even going into indigenous practices, which I felt more aligned to, like the big what people would call pagan practices. You know, I just felt like plant medicine was beautiful. I love astrology. I love all of these things that come from Mother Earth and nature, and yeah, I mean, connected to the spirit realm too. Like that is one thing that I feel like in our household was very like normal, like talking to ghosts and seeing ghosts and talking about predictions in our dream, or I felt this and I felt that. Astrology, we would talk about, oh, it's like the new moon and this. So it was so normal in my house. But yeah, we hid it from our rest of our family because the rest of our family was very religious and very like, oh, that's demonic, don't talk about it. So I
Wow.
did have this thing where I was very open within my immediate family, but when it came out to the rest of the world, you can't talk about it. So it was
Yeah.
always like a very taboo thing because they'll judge you, right? And I felt really constricted throughout that, and I didn't want to I didn't want to hide it. So I kind of came out of my Brujita closet when I started writing my book, my poetry book, because I started tapping. It was like poetry, but it was like rituals. And I was talking about this, and I was talking about my dreams, and I was talking about spirits and healing. You know, one of the things was healing, like healing these traumas that religion has put on us and these constrictions, like healing all of that and knowing that it comes from within. It's not something it's not good or evil. There's no like, it's beyond that. There's always these two little sides that you always have to pick, and it's like it's more than that. Like God is more than that, universe is more than that,
Yes.
and we're more than that. We're more than good and evil. There's just so much more layers to that, and that's what I learned from growing up. And yeah, it's been a trip trying to like take off those layers of like,
Yes.
you know, especially with the rest of the world, because I definitely get a lot of like, especially from our community, like, why do you call yourself a brujita? Like, what do you do? You know? And I was like, oh, it
Yes.
has nothing to do with putting spells on people or anything. It's more like for me, it's my healing, you know?
Yeah. It's like reclaiming a term. It's kind of like, in English, right, with the witchy stuff, right? Like I know a lot of people that consider themselves witches, and they always say like, it still has a negative stigma. And while that may be true, I think for like more of like the English Western perspective, I think even like in Latino cultures, bruja is still a very bad term. You don't really want to say it as much. Some people try to reclaim it, right? Like obviously yourself, in a way of like, I'm not over here doing like brujeria, like bad brujeria on people. I'm doing it for myself, for my
Mhm.
healing. And I feel like there's still somewhat of a delay in that term in Spanish, at least in my perspective. Um, but with that being said, I think you touched base on a couple of really interesting things. You talked about herbal magic, which I think is so amazing because I recently just did a thing on this where but I haven't posted it yet. So maybe by the time people listen to this, it'll be posted. But I saw a TikTok where these people that they're more on like the logical scientific side of things. They were talking about how scientists recently discovered that plants can talk with one another. And I just kind of laughed watching this TikTok because I'm like, this is what indigenous people have been saying for years, for thousands of years. And I just want to like add this blurb on here because it's so important for people to like just reflect on this, that while people may be like educated and academic, and I'm all for that, there's still truth and validation to what indigenous people say with their practices, whether it's astrology, whether it's herbal medicine, all these things. And sometimes science, yes, it needs to catch up to prove things, but sometimes there's a lot of validation in what we do, and we're not just like delulu silly people just because we love being outside or something. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
But
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I always think of like the civilizations before us, they were thriving way before us. Like they were thriving. And I mean, you see the structures that they built, they see the things that they created. That like you said, we're starting to tap into it. We're literally on like dusting it off, and we're seeing certain things, and I'm sure that there's so many things that we still don't know. But yeah, I mean, the plants alone, I mean, we talk to plants and they listen and they grow. Like my
Mhm.
parents, they're very connected to their plants. We grow a lot of vegetables, a lot of herbs. We have, I mean, I want to say like they have a green thumb, but the reality is they just know what they need and they talk to them, and they have conversations, and we'll be outside, and you know, especially during the pandemic, that's when I started really discovering more of my connection with plants. And I'm like, I love flowers. I love just being outside. I feel so much like energized. And it's just like really tapping into that energy with plants. And we're not really understanding how connected we are to herbal magic, and I used to even pull medicine from the earth that I wouldn't even know. I'm like, oh, this is for this and this is for that. And I didn't even know. It was just something that just like would tap into me. And and I would tell my mom, and I was like, oh yeah, that's for that. Like, you know, like, and it was just like a very natural connection that I would have, you know? And I think we all have it, especially if we come from that indigenous background. We feel it in our bones, like we feel it, like something's calling us when we're in nature. We I mean, what did they tell you when you're like, "Oh, go, have you been outside? Did you get some fresh air?" Like, not just the fresh air, it's like we're around like this, like, beautiful energy that's constantly, like, re-energizing us and feeding us, and vice versa. We're feeding them, you know?
Absolutely. And actually, speaking of like just like medicine and herbal stuff, do you like have you ever found what was like the most thing that surprised you when you were getting tapping into this? Like, what was something that you discovered? They're like, oh my God, this is why people do things. And I'll give you an example. Like my grandmother, she always grew in El Salvador. I'm Salvadorian. She would grow coconut trees in her front lawn, and she would like swear by coconut water, even though I found it gross, but she would swear by it. She's like, it's good for your kidneys, it's good for this. I'm like, what? It had all these properties? So what about you? Did you have a moment of like, oh my God, this is so cool. I didn't realize that this does.
Yeah, you know what it was? I had trouble sleeping, and there is so obviously you take lavender, you do all of these things. We have like a white sage in our
Mm,
backyard. And I never ever thought of like sage, and I started using the sage, not just like through like teas, but like just in general
mm,
through my own rituals and everything. And the amount like I it also gives you like a tap into different, you know, visions and realities, and it
mm.
kind of changed my whole perspective on like it was like my
Wow.
shrooms. It was like my shroom, but like it didn't feel like shrooms. Like I want to also see like people have this connection to different plants, and they'll have a connection, and you'll start really like n- connecting, and you start tapping into different energies, and you tap into, and I feel like that was my medicine. Like that's when I talk about past lives. I am really connected to different past lives because that was the plan that did it for me. That I was like, oh, there's more than us, and we're all living these like different realities, and we're seeing different past lives. And I'm, you know, sometimes I'm like, oh crap, like this is this reality, but I feel like when I'm connected, I can connect to a different reality. And
Yeah.
I know it sounds strange to some people. They're like, no, you're only living one life. And I'm like, no, we're not. There's
Yeah.
so many different things that we're not seeing. And that was my medicine, that white sage. And I really looked into it, and it was like a whole different, you know, very connected to that.
Wow.
So yeah, and it so happened to be growing in my backyard. Like it wasn't like there's certain things that grow that we purposely grow, and there's other things that are just growing, and that was just growing, you know. And I also have a really connection to like Frida Kahlo, like, you know, and Diego Rivera, the artist. Like I
Yes.
always like just connect to them because they're artists that I grew up with, I studied, and I have them the lilies, the Alcatraz lilies, the Keller lilies that grow, they grow
Oh.
like wildly in my front yard all the time. Like anytime that I'm going through
Oh.
this like artist doubt, you know, like I'm like, what am I doing with my life? I just start seeing these random Keller lilies just, and they're all in their paintings, you know. So I'm like, okay, and it just like gives me a connection to it. And maybe it's all in my head, or maybe it is like a connection that I built, that every time I see that flower, I like, you know, reconnect. So you never know. I mean, that's even with symbols of like when you see a hummingbird, when you see a butterfly,
Yes.
things like that, Mother
Yes.
Nature, it's not just plants, it could be animals, it could be, you know, the moon, like symbols of the moon, like it's just different things. Like I have these connections with different animals and different beings, and every time I'm like, I feel something or I'm thinking of something and I see an animal, I'm like, oh, I'm good.
Mhm.
Or I dream it, it's just really different. It's you build your own connection. The more self-aware you are, the more that you reconnect and you lose
Yes.
that stigma of, oh, it's devil or it's bad or it's black magic or whatever. You start becoming more self-aware of what your body and what your lineage and what you gravitate to,
Mhm.
without
Yes.
being influenced by religion or family or society.
Oh, absolutely. You touched on something that was so important. I think so. There's a lot of conversation on I would say, I was just going to call it the metaphysical community, spiritual community regarding sage. And while I do think it's a very sacred plant, I do think that sometimes it misses the mark where it's highly stigmatized just to North American indigenous people. But in fact, sage is also very important to Mexico and Central America and the Americas. So can you speak a little bit more about that? Because I feel like there's a misconception about that, like, oh, you're not a North American indigenous person, so you cannot use it. Which I'm like, I don't know.
So that is a very colonial mentality. Before we were colonized, before the Spanish conquest, before British, there was one tribe. It was one big tribe along the south, the north, the central. I mean, even though you're in Salvador, we have a lot of relatives that look alike. I mean, we all, that's why they're like, oh, you look alike. We were one big tribe. The
Hmm.
only thing that separates us now is these borders and these mentalities of, well, this is this state, this is this state, this is here. We all knew we were one people and we were all separated. We were all in different regions, but we all knew we were brothers. Like
Hmm.
there was a connection between these tribes. And I don't, I mean, there's history of like, oh, there's wars back then, but I think that these civilizations thrived for such a long time that they helped each other for a long time. They had
Yeah.
different resources, they would trade. There was a lot of bartering. They had their own systems of how to survive and how to help one another. At the end of the day, we were one big tribe, right? So that's why there's different plants and different connections and different similarities between Northern
Hmm.
American natives to who was born in Mexico, we have been colonized, so we have had mixed blood and everything, but there's still very much that call to our back to our roots. Like I don't
Yes.
care. A lot of us carry a lot of indigenous blood, and we connect so much more with the land that we're on than any European. And you might still go to Europe and be like, I love this place, but you have this land. Like I know that even though my parents came here in the 70s, the land that I'm on right now, I live in LA. I
Hmm.
feel like I've lived here for thousands
Yes.
and thousands of years. Like
Yes.
I feel it so connected to this land. And yes, I'll go to Mexico and feel so connected to that. But like there's something about the migration of going back and forth that I know that was in my family. And when I look up like the roots of my family, and I still have like blurbs in there, but I feel like there was a constant up and down migration. We would come up for season for food, and then we would go down to the south for a different type of climate. I mean, we
Hmm.
would travel just like the monarch butterfly. They talk about the monarch butterfly. We have such a connection to the monarch butterfly
Yes.
because it migrates north to the south, during the winter. So it is one big tribe. Thinking that we're different from these tribes and that it was one big tribe, we're one
Yes.
people, and we have very similar practices and we have similar connections, and those plants grow we have this very similar weather too. Like, LA has a very similar weather to Mexico and it's maybe hotter down there, but we have
Hmm.
very similar in different seasons. We have very similar weather. So it just it's science sometimes. Like people want to like go back and be like, oh, it's metaphysical, but it's also science. It's also history. It's also in art. So if you look at our art is ripe with that's in their time. And a lot of our Mesoamerican artists or people that were there, they would put it in art. They did it in these sculptures and these paintings
Yes.
and and then it just goes and tells you like, and there's a lot of things that are missing obviously due to colonialism, but we that's what we go into the self-awareness. I always go back to yourself. What do you feel when you
Yes.
start destigmatizing everything else, when you start decolonizing yourself and saying that there's no black and white, this belongs here, this belongs there? When you start letting go of those structures and you realize that you've been indoctrinated your whole life and you don't even know what the hell you're doing, you start kind of like, let me just be more self-aware and follow my intuition, and that's what I've been
Absolutely.
doing. The older I get, the more that I'm like, all right, that was bullshit. Now I'm gonna figure out my own way. So
Yeah. No, I love that because you said something that I'm like, oh my God, that just struck a chord. I feel like I've had past lives here also in Southern California. Like there's some places I'll go and I'm like, oh my God, this just
mhm,
feels like so like no wonder I was born here in this lifetime. And I did an ancestry and I remember at first, because it's always changing, like there's always an update on ancestry. But I remember when I first did it, it highlighted like the tip of Mexico and then onto like Guatemala, El Salvador, and like all of that. And then of course now it's more like narrowed down to El Salvador with like a little bit of like even like parts of Mexico sometimes show up.
mhm,
And so like to your point, I was like, yeah, we all migrated back and forth. So it just makes sense. And my husband, so his grandmother, we say indigenous Mexican because like there's the indigenous of Arizona. You know how people get all technical, but technically Mexico.
yeah,
But it showed up in like parts of Arizona and a little bit more north from there to Mexico, and even Peru. I was like, whoa, what? So to your point, yeah, people do migrate, and so sage has always felt like a very like I don't know, it's just a plant that I feel like I've known for so long in my life, not even just here, but I was introduced to sage in my early 20s, and I'm like, this feels so familiar to me.
yeah,
Uh, what? And it just was a mind-blowing thing. Granted, now when I do my stuff online though, I still try to give like alternatives for people that are not like, have roots here in the Americas just because like, I know that it's a very sacred plant and all the dangers of it, but I love that you touch base on that. Like it's so important for people to understand the gravity of that.
yeah,
Um so now I want to transition into just like more of like your work of like I know you mentioned herbal magic. I know you mentioned a little bit of astrology and communication with spirits. And I want to like preface this by saying that like spirits and paranormal topics, I do a lot of that on my channel. And I want people to understand that there's two different types of paranormal. There's the religious paranormal phenomenon, and then there's non-religious. And the way I categorize that is that religious paranormal stuff is like people saw La Virgen de Guadalupe or something like that.
mhm,
Like some form of an angel or something like that. Whereas like I think non-paranormal stuff is like you see the lady in white walking down a highway and she's hitchhiking or something. I think ancestral paranormal phenomenon is also partially religious, but not in that like monotheistic Abrahamic religion way.
mhm.
What was like a paranormal experience that you had maybe growing up or something that was really like predominant in your life at some point?
Oh my God, I think I've had it my whole life. I think there's always been this joke that Natalie, so I had an imaginary friend growing up.
Oh, wow.
I had that for a long time when I was little. And my mom would be like, "Oh, I think she's just talking to like different ghosts or spirit." Like it was automatically like that. I don't remember this imaginary friend, but I do remember a very incident where I remember how to chair, and I'm like, "Okay, now you jump from the chair." And I remember that. I don't even know why, but I remember that that just pops in my head, but I don't even see that person or whoever was in. But I felt like it was another kid. Throughout my whole life, I've also spotted different like I used to tell like scary stories. I'm like, oh, this happened next door, and then this and this and this. Like, I had this scary story where I was like trying to scare my little cousins that this house next door burned down, and then there's a kid that was in there, and I started having this like just trying to scare them. And I don't know if I manifested or if I actually knew because that little boy was like sitting right there at the ledge like the next day. Like me, I was riding my bike and I look up and I'm like, oh my God, there's a little boy next door looking at me. And I knew automatically knew it was a ghost. Like, and it wasn't like when people think of ghosts, they think, oh, white spirit. Like, I don't know how it appears to different people, but for me, they look like people. They're people. Like, I'm like, oh crap. Like, so that's happened like multiple times in my life where I'm like, sometimes I'm like, is it people or is it a spirit? Is it real people? Like, did I just tap into different things? But I also have those spiritual, like, kind of like the religious. I have Donatsi, which is La Virgen de Guadalupe. There's a constant like connection with her that I have, like the goddess. And I'll have a image of her. I'll see it in a car, in the dirt, like the dirt of a car,
Mm.
like a dirty car. When I need it the most, I'll see an angel like in my dreams, and I'll wake up and I'll feel the coldness on my fingers, or I'll see a feather whenever like whenever and I'll see a big feather, like a big white feather. It is definitely had these strange, encounters where I can't even explain it, where I even feel sometimes like, is this really like, you know, did this just happen to me? Like there was the last one that I had that I kind of like fell off my chair. I was talking to my friend about it. Like, I'm like, oh, when you see a ghost or you feel a ghost is around, you just tell them to go away. My mom always said that, go away. Salte. My mom's a very she cusses like a sailor and she talks in Spanish and she'll cuss like a sailor. And she just like,
My mom's the
whenever
same
I see
way.
a ghost, I say, get the fuck out of my house. Like, she starts screaming, right? And I'm like, I was telling that to my friend, and as soon as I'm cussing, I look up and I see a little boy again, and he's in the 19, like probably Great Depression. And I was in my apartment building at that time. There was no other kids but my own kid. And my kid, it was in school. So I knew that nobody in that apartment building had kids, but I see this little boy coming out and he's literally dressed like it was the Great Depression. And I lived in West Hollywood at that time. And yeah, and it was like I was looking around and I'm like, and it was during Halloween time too. And I was just like, and I'm seeing him like with a big stick, limping, like his whole outfit was just it was giving me great depression. I was like, this is crazy. And I'm looking at him leave, like literally open the
Whoa.
door and leave. And I was like, oh shit, I literally told him to leave. Like, you know, um, fell out of my chair because again, it was a person and I
Yeah.
had seen strange things through that because I had little pumpkins outside of my door and my stoop and they would just be flying everywhere. Like I would come home and they would be rolled everywhere and I'm like, and I would put them back. I'm like, that who keeps kicking my pumpkins? And before he left, he got his stick and kicked hit one of my little pumpkins. It was so funny. And I was just like, where did I tap into? But it again, when I say like it's a blurred between this reality and other realities. And living in West Hollywood, I knew the history of West Hollywood. I mean, we all know, like it's
Yeah.
very much living in West Hollywood is actually where I felt the most very much. I feel like I've lived there before. I felt like I had roots there before. Um, even with like the whole golden Hollywood era thing
Yeah.
there too. I felt it. Like it's not a coincidence that I'm an artist. I'm in theater and I'm in music right now. It's not a
Yeah.
coincidence that I'm in this life. I'm doing that because I feel like I was in that and it was living there pushed me into this. And it reminded me of a time for that. So I do remember that I felt like this click of like, okay, I belong in this and I'm just going to do it
Mhm.
differently. I felt like that time in my period in the West, when I was in West Hollywood and I was tapping into the old Hollywood era, I felt like I was in an era where I had fucked up or somebody had fucked me over. And this time around, I was going to do art for my community and for me, not for
Mhm.
the greed. I felt like there was a lot of greed there too. So it
That's
was
so
like,
crazy you say that because I was picking up on that before. So I don't mean to cut you off, but I was literally about to say like I was going to ask you a question and then you just answered it. That's wild. So I felt what you just said. Like no
yeah.
joke. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
no, I do. I tapped into it and then when I left West Hollywood, it was like a time for like, okay, you're done here. Go. Like, you know how you say, "Oh, I've been in this places." There was this time where it was like, "Okay, you're gone." You picked up because that's where I also wrote my book. That's where I finished my
Oh.
book. That's where I kind of really tapped in. That's where I really was like, "Okay, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this with intention and I'm going to do this the way that I've always wanted to do it. Not
Mhm.
where people are influencing me, not where people are pushing me." And I felt that I was kind of redoing my life the way I was supposed to do it. But yeah, it was a
Yes.
lot of I felt like it was a lot of grief, a lot of and it wasn't just within me, it was like I had influences from different people in that era. So, but yeah, it was it's strange times where I tap into a different reality, but tap into past lives a lot in myself. I think when you become again more self-aware, you're starting to see the darkness within you too.
Yes.
We all have darkness, we all have light, we were all the best people, or we also
Mhm.
have free will, so we didn't make the best choices for ourselves or for everybody around us. So we come back and we have to learn those lessons and change them. So
Yeah.
I feel very, very at peace of where I'm going. And even like talking to you because I'm going to do a theater show, and I'm like, and in West Hollywood, by the way, like I'm literally the theaters in West Hollywood, so it's a crazy like full circle moment.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, what I was gonna say too is like, you mentioned astrology and you're talking about past lives. It's so interesting that you're talking about that because I know like have you ever done astrocartography where you see like where the planets align? And it's
Yeah.
so wild because my Jupiter and my sun is in like near LA. So like, but I left LA and I went to Denver where my Mars is, where it's supposed to be more
Mm,
challenging. And I
yeah.
always felt like I love Denver, Colorado. I was born here in LA, but I love Denver, Colorado, and it's beautiful. But I just felt like that these are not my people. And when I moved back to LA, I realized that the community, I'm like, why did I reject LA? Like the people, the locals here, I'm going to say locals because I feel like it's the transplants that create a different culture for LA. But the
Yeah.
locals here, especially like Latinos, they're the most uplifting people in my creative journey. They're the most uplifting. I'm embracing it more so now than ever. Um, so have you ever checked your astrocartography and seen like where your planets are?
Yes, I have my planets, which is crazy because both of these planets are in my creative house, my fifth house, my childhood house, my inner child. It's Pluto and Saturn, so it's not the hard. These are pretty tough planets, right? So, but the more that I look at the more that it makes sense, and this is where I like do a lot of my growth, my rebirth, a lot of hard work, and where I always come back to for those challenging rebirth moments where this is where I had my kid, this is where I have my family, this is so it's really crazy that it's connected to it's my childhood. And every time it is one of those like I have to put in work here.
Yes.
And when I leave somewhere else like New York, I have my son there, so I'm shining. I feel like, oh my god, all my work is like going in, but it's a lot of ego, so
Yeah.
it's like so I definitely want to continue. I've been to Mexico too, where it is my Venus is in there too, and I feel more alive and I feel more like just have different things. So I haven't gone into the places where I really feel like, okay, let me double check like if these are
Yeah.
it. But I have been checking that. Like that's where I want to like continue living my life through this like astrocartography, like literally traveling and going into my Jupiter line, going to my Venus line,
Yes.
going into these, but yeah, I have Saturn and Pluto in this in LA particularly. And it was funny because I was actually seeing that, and it's like where I would grow my wealth, where I would if I want to gain fame or gain recognition, this is where it is. But it's based on hard work. So it's
Yes.
based on Saturn, right? Like Saturn, I got to put in that work. And Saturn is also connected to my Capricorn or like the Capricorn energy. So it's the older you get. So it's an
Oh,
older
that's me
energy.
too.
So
Yep.
yeah, there we go. So it's like I know that I have to put in the work. I know, and knowing those things, it just some people are like, oh no, I want to go where it's easy, but like you got to put in work too. And I feel at home here because it is in my childhood. But yeah, like you said, like I rejected the locals, like. You're not gonna find like, oh, just because it's Jupiter doesn't mean it's all gonna be all gravy. There's
Yeah.
lessons that you have to learn there, and then you have to there's certain people that you want to reconnect with, and I'm so glad that you talked about the locals too, because it is tapping into that's part of my mission because I am from here. I was born here, and my family's been here for decades. That I feel like a lot of people look at LA as this like Hollywood and everyone. And don't get me wrong, there is that part, but there is also locals that are also here that are in that art world that don't think that way, that don't feel that
Exactly.
way, that are very much like I'm part of a community theater group that it's from the streets. We're from a community. We grew up with no like little to no resources. We're not privileged. We don't know anybody in Hollywood. We're just kind of thriving on our talent, learning to refine our artistry. And we're all Latinos, we're all Chicanos because we don't, there is a very much, we're segregated here. If you really
Yeah.
look at it, there's a big segregation. The freeways are over here, while over here is like clean and beautiful. And then you go over here into black and brown neighborhoods, and it's a lot of like this environmental injustices happening here. And people
Yes.
don't see that. They just see it because, oh, the Hollywood light. But if you really dig deep, you start really seeing and connecting with the people from like these rural communities, which are my communities, where we're also dealing with injustices that are happening throughout the world. And we're not, and there's a lot of money here, and yet we're not taking care of our neighborhoods. And so the people have to unite and really uplift each
Yes.
other, you know?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because I feel like, I mean, I lived in Minnesota. My mom moved to Minnesota when I was younger. My sisters, my dad's side of the family has always stayed here. So I spent every summer, every holiday out here. So like I never left LA essentially. But I was always so close to my cousins, and I would always see their demeanor was so different than my demeanor because I ended up going to a small town in Minnesota, white predominant community, and I just hated like I didn't realize it then, but I hated how I looked, how I was different, and all of this stuff. And then I moved to Colorado, and that really awoke in my spirituality. I had a lot of Indigenous friends there that really helped amplify that spirituality of myself. And then moving back here, I was like, wow, like I really love our community more than ever. I don't think I could ever have loved it if I didn't leave and come back. And
Mhm.
what you're saying, it's so important. That's why, like, I'm always like, no, like being in this space, like doing paranormal content, and especially for you, like doing your artistic endeavors and your local stuff and the stuff that you do online, it's so important for us to uplift these voices when they're not in the room. I'm always trying to advocate for that. And I feel like for me, when I started doing this content, I'm gonna be mean about that, but it's like the people that you see on TV, the people that like are the faces of the paranormal, even content creators, they're all white people. And I think all of us on these sidelines are noticing that. And so I
Mhm.
guess my question for you is like how do you see that too? Like do you acknowledge that? Do you see it? How do you like how's your perspective been on witnessing spirituality, witnessing paranormal topics online and media?
Well, yeah, I mean, even the witchy topic, right? Being witches, like you, when I grew up watching The Craft, the Sabrina, the Teenage Witch, like all of these shows, and Buffy the Vampire, all of these superheroes, and all the blonde, blue-eyed witches were portrayed as these good witches, superheroes, saving the earth, while the evil was like women who are tapping into like voodoo or santeria, or like they're looked at strange, they're looked at like, oh, they're just doing practicing black magic, or they're there's just like this stigma, right? And or they're not existent at all. It's either they're this or they're not existent at all, but they're not the hero, they're not the like and for me that was what really kind of like I tapped into. I knew I was a witch. Like I was just like, I'm a witch. Like, I just knew that I connected to that. And I definitely saw that growing up, and I wanted to change that. That's why I changed my it's Brujita Jardin, because I wanted to bring that childhood in me, that child that looked at these shows that was like, I'm doing this for my community. I want to save my community. I'm doing this, I'm that girl who's going through these like coming of age things in this world, and um discovering her magic and discovering her gifts. And I feel like even at 30, I'm older. I'm 38 now. I didn't click my magic, like I tap into it until 35. I really like started, oh, what is happening? Like these visions are got stronger. These, energies got stronger. My gifts got stronger. It didn't start, and that's why obviously my art got stronger, because of this tapping into. So I felt like I'm coming of age. There's like these rebirth seasons of me, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that was my thing. I was like, that's why I created La Bonita Jardín, for little girls, for little Latinas and little brown girls to look at themselves and be like, this is not evil. I can be a hero, or I can be this, I can be my own hero. Like, I don't have to, I'm not evil. That's why I also get into theater. I would love to start continuing writing all about brujitas through the lens of a brown girl. I have all these stories, these books that I want to write, these things that I want to act out and bring my friends in it. We can be the Sabrina the teenage. We could be, different things, even if it is playful, but it does change. And don't see that, you grow up thinking that you don't belong. You grow up self-hating. You grow up doubting, that imposter
Mm.
syndrome, the whole, all I've gone through all of that, especially with theater, especially as a writer. I was in ESL, for God's sakes, like
Me too. I was in
I
ESL up
was in
until like ninth
ESL. So
grade.
exactly. So it's like you and it's crazy because I look back and I'm like, I knew two languages. How do you put me in ESL? I know how to write and read in two languages. I know how to express myself in two languages. And yet you put me in an ESL program where I knew double of what other people, like, you know what I'm saying? So I've used that to my advantage now, where I don't see that as a negative, where even they told me it was negative. it's not negative for me. Whatever I'm doing is reshape that narrative that they constantly put on us. So yeah, the one thing with La Bruja Jardin is to reshape that narrative in witchcraft, especially in this space where we can practice, can still practice and light a candle and connect back to it. It doesn't have to be super religious. So I bring aspects of the Catholic religion into it, but I use it the way that I want to use it, and um it's very, very, we've evolved as a culture.
Absolutely. And it's so beautiful how you said all of that because like it made me very emotional. Like I remember doing ESL and I remember being put as the rebellious kid or the hot-headed kid. I'm like, I'm angry because everyone gets to do like I'm a millennial, so everyone gets to do like the typing fun classes for computer and I get to sit here in ESL when like what the heck? So I would get mad because I don't know if you ever noticed that too, where like you would be put in the ESL in the hour where everyone's doing all the fun stuff, but you're in ESL and you're just like,
Yeah. No, and you know what? I ended up testing amazing in my reading and comprehension. Like I know that I'm a great writer. I knew I was a great writer back then because even my daughter, she's a writer, right? And then I ended up testing and I ended up being put in the regular English or the advanced English class. And I remember being asked, like, what are you doing here? Like by other kids that were white. And they were like, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in ESL. And I was like, no, I belong here. Then you have these outside systems that tell you,
Mhm.
no, you're not good enough for that. Like, and that's in every industry, from the paranormal industry, the beauty industry. If you're a content creator, you see it. And it's so that's why I always encourage our community to stick with one another, to uplift one another. And same thing for our
Yes.
white counterparts too. If you see, like, I used to work in PR. I was in a very white industry in an office with other white women, and I got to a point where I was in leadership and I would train, young interns that were coming in and they were white. And I'm like, yo, like one of my things when I want you guys to know to keep it very diverse, because I would notice the not lack of
Yes.
diversity. And I would tell them, I'm like, this is important. Like, this is the work that you can do as an ally or an advocate for us. Like, oh, talk about, like, stand up and be like, hey, it's not diverse enough, because I can say it all day, but if you're not saying it or you're not with me, then there is a disconnection. You see a space where there isn't people of color, and then I don't want to see one or two, and then that makes it, okay. No, it is like a full on, like, it is. It should be open to more than one Latina, one more than Black girl, one more than Black man.
Know sometimes, like you just said, there's some of us that are in the community that are so competitive, and I don't understand why. But when we feel like we are a unity and community, it is like the most beautiful thing ever that I haven't experienced ever in my life until in this moment. In these last couple of years, I've been back in LA. But I want to segue into speaking of representation and brujeria and the witch representation and all of that stuff. I did a topic a while back, but I want to bring it on this podcast because I want to keep retelling the story that the witch trials also didn't just happen in Salem, in North America, Salem. It happened also in Mexico. It happened in Central America, and there's a story where this woman. She, back to that colonial time where they were being like colonized, and there was even like the caste system of like the more indigenous you look, or if you had a partner that was African, then you were at the bottom of the totem pole. So you had to work your way up through just like appearance wise to move up through like a class system. And around
Mhm.
that time frame, I think this was like what, the 1600s, right? I'm trying to remember, but basically, like there was the witch trials were happening in Mexico, Central America, and one of the things was cacao, right? The
Mhm.
chocolate. The chocolate was what the indicator. It was like a chocolate war. So these women would create spells and rituals out of cacao, and the European people would look at that and be like, "Oh, I don't know if I can drink this because it's witchcraft." So they were being hunted down by even just making hot chocolate, your coffee, your
I
hot
know.
chocolate. And I thought that was the most wild thing that I learned in terms of that. But that story isn't told as often. Have you ever heard of this before?
Yeah, and not specifically in the regions of Mexico, but I mean, just in general, just look at the erasure of Indigenous people. We had our Indigenous practices, like, a lot of indigenous people couldn't even dance because it was
Mm.
considered dancing with the, you know, like
Oh,
they couldn't
yes.
wear their feathers. Like that alone is, they might not be pointing hats and witches and doing like, but it was their practice. It was the way they connected to the spirits of their ancestors, to the universe, to whoever, Mother Nature. They weren't allowed to that. We like, when you think of the genocide of the indigenous people, it started as a witch trial. It really
Mm.
was. It was like, who's wearing it? You needed to assimilate into Catholic religion or Christian religion, and you needed to do that, or you perish, you die,
And
you
some of the
murder.
plants, yeah, some of the, and that's how some of the plants went away. So like I was speaking to my friend, one of my best friends, they're Mexican, and I forgot what plant she was saying. She's like, "Does that grow in El Salvador?" I'm like, "No, it doesn't." But that's weird that it would grow there and not here. And it's
Yeah,
like a type of tree, because we're talking about horchata, how horchata is very different.
yeah, yeah. They're
and
yeah, from Salvador. And yes, yes, it is. It is. They're just
and
sweeter.
so
It's so different, but I love it. Yeah,
yeah, and so we were talking because she finally tried Salvadorian horchata, and so we're talking about that. Where her mom was there, and she was talking about like how they make horchata versus like how El Salvador makes horchata, and we're like, well, these plants are not there, and I'm like, wait a minute, that is so bizarre. But it goes back to what you're saying. It was like the witch hunts and all this stuff. Like, oh no, they're making that horchata. It's witchcraft. We got to ban this
yeah.
plant.
And it was our own like practices. Corn for me has been one of those like plants that I'm like, I know I was hunted for this. Like, I
Ooh,
remember because we would do corn ceremonies in my family. Like I explored that region of where my dad particularly is from. My dad has a very roots in corn and growing corn and in molino and making tortillas and anything with corn. And I remember we would do and I remember I say that I ate popcorn and I like tapped into this corn ceremony that we would do, like a corn festival. And I remember being like that in general, like being hunted down, like we were not allowed to do that anymore. Like I tapped into that in general, and I have this affinity with corn, you know. But I feel like even that corn, even corn, like when I'm talking about corn, and when you think of corn for indigenous people, it's very significant. It fed the whole family. Even the growing process of corn is very difficult. And then when we finally harvest it, that's a whole ceremony of its own. And when you're feeding it and you're saving it, and corn preserves itself so you can eat it all year long and you can make different foods with it. So it's so significant to our culture, Latino culture, because it is comes from our indigenous practices. We don't talk about this enough, but it's because we also don't know our history. We have to really tap into our own history and talk about it and talk to our ancestors, talk to our grandparents, talk to this. And
I could be completely wrong, but I'll add it in the notes if I can find an article regarding this. But I quickly just did like a quick scan over of it. But basically, like corn is so heavily regulated. I think corn and I think green beans, I don't remember anymore, but they're or soy, but they're heavily regulated by the government. So you can't like even like own corn fully for yourself because it's government owned. And like there's some plants here to the Americas, that's why it's not like you can't just go anywhere and be like, I'm gonna grow corn, because it's like heavily regulated. And that goes to show the history of what you just said. It's such a sacred plant to some of these communities and these cultures, and the government came in, they're like, corn, I see it's sacred, I'm taking this, we're taking this and making it
exactly.
for us and modifying corn for ourselves now, but you can't own it.
Which is crazy. That's what I'm saying. You do these simple searches and you start tapping it and you're like, wait a minute. And it's again still going and we're not realizing it because we're not talking about it. We're not expressing ourselves. We're afraid of it.
I'm pretty sure it is. Like, there's something like it says here, like in the United States, the corn industry is predominantly in private sector with farmers and corporations. Notice how it says farmers and corporations, not like an individual person. The
Mm-mm.
government's role is primarily regulatory and supportive through these. So it basically, they do a lot of regulation with it.
I think with Mexico too, the government with Mexico, I think there has been an ongoing thing too, where I think the United States wanted to come in and control the corn in Mexico too and modify it there and grow
And
GMO.
bananas.
Yeah, and yeah, so there's been like this, and Mexico's been repelling that too. So they're like, no,
Yeah.
because you can't touch our corn. Everything we do is corn, like corn tortillas, or todo, like everything is corn,
Yes.
So it is I'm glad that we're like our people are standing up and being open and being able to put these like, things two to two together. But yeah, we need to explore it more because it is definitely and understand the plants that connect with you too.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we could talk forever, and I know we're coming close to an end here, but before we get into the conclusion here, I just want to quickly ask you in terms of ancestral thing, because I know we touched on a couple of other things, but do you do like I know Dia de los Muertos is a huge one, but
Mhm,
aside from that, like what are other ways that people? Because I know everyone knows that, and now even that's becoming a little bit inappropriate. How
mhm.
people are taking away things from Dia de los Muertos. And I've touched base on this topic on my podcast a few times, and even in my content about how people don't honor the dead in the way like Mexico does, or like I know for Central America, for me we call it All Saints Day, but spend the day and we go to the tombstones and we clean it and we decorate it. But I think the Dia de los Muertos more lively. Uh,
It is, it is.
uh,
We go party. We party hard with
yeah,
those.
I'm a little jealous on that front. But it's so funny because at least I know that we do it based on like the Aztecs, the Mayans, and all the tribes that were out there and stuff like that. And so I guess my question for you is, how do you honor the dead? How do you do ancestry work? And like, what do you have to say to that? How it's becoming a little bit more appropriated, and it's just I kind of cringe when I see the Halloween stuff with the other
Yeah,
Muertos.
I'm very protective of our sacred practices. I'm very protective of it. And, and there's certain people that protect, like, I love that you, like, with sage, you're very protective of the sacredness of that. And you just talk about it and you're like, hey, there's our alternatives. Same thing with Dia de los Muertos. Dia de los Muertos is really significant in my family. My mom's place where she comes from, Zapotlanejo, they actually have the biggest, they've gone on the World Guinness record to have the biggest altar, so there's like huge calaveras and huge altars, and it's beautiful, and we go all out, and it's right in front of the church, which is like, people are like, what, it's right in front of the church, and it's like this huge altar. We sell, like, the way I sell it is, I mean, yes, Dia de los Muertos is a significant time that we celebrate, but I do it all year long. I have my own altar. I have my abuelita's, my grandma was like very significant. I have my abuelita's apron right next to me in my
I
desk.
love that.
Anytime it's like Mother's Day or her anniversary, the death of her anniversary, it really resonates within me. So I'm always either writing, I take time to myself, I go outside, I journal a lot. Obviously, I do my poetry. So that's how I honor like the lineages that come through me, like, and the dead. And even like exploring, I had a big fear of death. I have this
Mm.
fear of like, oh, what happens when you die? And I don't want to die. And I don't leave even with the theater practices, I play an angel. I play an angel that comes back and sees her family alive, and I'm just like fine. And people are like, "Oh, you play an angel? Like that's not like that's cool." And I was like, "No, but you don't understand it. It made me really sad. Like I don't want to be an angel looking at my family live their life, and I'm just like over here an angel." And I'm
Yeah.
like, it is beautiful, but there was a part of me that was like scared of it, and I had to face that. So I think for me, it's been facing it through my art. And it's so funny that things correlate. I need to say it within myself and celebrate it and know that, I will continue on regardless. So we also have to explore death within ourselves. We go through life and death every day, these cycles.
Yes.
Like we let go of people, relationships, and we might be afraid of it. We might be afraid to let go, but at the same time, that's what the Dia de los Muertos is, a celebration to let go and to release and to connect and reconnect as well. You learn, you gain memories, and even though they're no longer with us or they're not with you, that you still hold those memories within you, and they helped you thrive to where you are now. Same thing with our family members. If it wasn't for our family members, like my grandma she did so many sacrifices.
Before we wrap up, I just want to say, where can people find you?
Yes, you can find me on my IG is La Brujita Jardin. I also have my personal IG where you can see more of like my array of things. I have Chicana Nats. And then my website's labrujitajardin.com where you can get my book too.
Oh,
My book is
yay.
Cosmica. You can also find it on Barnes and Noble, Amazon, and Walmart. Cosmica by Natalie Garcia. It's a poetic journey to awakening the magic within. There's rituals, poetry in there. And I also have my own show too. It's called Chicana in the City too. But that's like a whole different, that's exploring. So if you're really connected to community, you want to explore more of like the Latino and Chicano community, please check that out because I do talk a lot
Yes.
about like, and it's more in like the entrepreneur and the arts and everything too. And yeah, and I'm going to be at the Hollywood. I don't know when this is going to air, but I'm going to be in a theater show called the Last Days of Judas Iscariot, where we put Judas on trial, and I play an angel. Yes, it's very it's historical and religion, but it's a dark comedy, and it's a all Latino cast. It's in the Hollywood Fringe Festival, Latino cast and crew. It's probably one of the only plays that has a all Latino cast and crew. So
Wow.
please check that out on hollywoodfringe.org and check out the show dates. We have a couple in June, and hopefully I continue to do more things like this. But yeah, if you want to check me out, La Brujita Jardin and Chicana Nats.
I'm going to put all that stuff in the description, guys. So when you do listen to this, please check the description, follow her, check out her book. And I really, really can't thank you enough for being here. This is such
Thank
an
you.
amazing conversation. Remember, guys, stay strange.
Stay strange. Yes. Thank you.